we always want to like pay the least amount of taxes to Uncle Sam. How do we do that? The nice thing, hey, if all my rental properties were to pass on to my kids, they get the stepped up basis, which means, hey, if I bought these properties for $100,000 and now they're worth $1 million, my kid inherits at the $1 million basis. And if they go to sell it, they're not selling the difference between $100,000. They're selling the profit between $1 million. Hey, Colorado, Chris Lopez here, and we're going to go into some details about how to create generational wealth with real estate. I mean, that is the dream for so many investors out there, myself included. And the stats are scary. 70% of the wealth is lost in the second generation. 90% is lost in the third generation. So we got some scary numbers in here, and I've got a great guest. We're going to go into some details. Pam Maass with Law Mother. What's up, Pam?
Hey, Chris. Excited to be here.
It's been a while since we've been in the studio together.
I know. I had a baby. You had a baby.
Yes. And that's why we have to talk how to make sure that our babies have some wealth in the future. So I think a lot of you guys know Pam. She is an estate attorney here in Denver. She did my plan quite a number of years ago. She's on my client's plan out there. And over the years, we have just always shared ideas, often gone to each other. Hey, I've got a client in this situation, help him out, vice versa. And now we're going to go into some more details about what we need to do. So Pam, what % of your clients have real estate, would you say?
Ooh, I would say probably about, 90% have a primary home at least, right?
Yeah, I should say a rental property.
I would say probably about like 50% or more, kind of in a given month.
Okay, so about half, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so, we're going to talk about this from like some of like the legal protections, like, hey, the trust, the LLCs, how to protect the assets, how to minimize taxes as well. But also, like, how do we set up our kids for success? I have heard so many horror stories. You've heard so many horror stories about once the real estate's passed down to the kids, there's oftentimes issues, lawsuits, infighting, there's issues. So we're going to talk all about this today. So give us an example of like your typical real estate client that comes in there. What's their situation? Like age, rental properties, kids? What do you see?
Yeah, so I've been seeing a big trend lately of people kind of in their 50s or 60s who have big real estate portfolios, like 10 to 20 properties, and their kiddos are in a position to take over managing that real estate. And they're at an age right now where it's fine for them to manage it, but they're kind of seeing, hey, I'm getting older. I'm not going to be able to self-manage this forever. My kids aren't in a position to step in and take over. What should I do? And from a legal standpoint, we can put the structures in place, but then there's kind of this other strategy component, which we're going to be talking about today, which we really, can't handle fully on the legal side, right? It brings in so many different elements that I'm excited to talk about today.
Yeah, well, let's dive into like from the big picture of setting things up. And before hit record, you went through some very interesting stats between the Rockefeller family and the Vanderbilt family. I think that is a really good place to start.
Yeah, so I think the Rockefeller and Vanderbilt family is a really good contrast because a lot of people don't realize kind of the differences. So the Rockefellers, you may remember, they started out with Standard Oil in the 1870s. They now today are ExxonMobil, Chevron, and they put in place really great estate planning. So they put in place irrevocable trust. They put in place life insurance, kind of the family banking. They did a lot of really great things. They set up family businesses where they had family constitutions. They put a lot in place to protect that generational wealth. And today, their 70 heirs have over $8.4 billion between them. Whereas the Vanderbilt family, they were kind of considered at that same time, royalty in America. They were behind the railroads, right? And they had a massive, massive, massive estate. Today, it's worth about $1.5 million. Yes,
million with an M.
Million with an M. And when Gloria Vanderbilt passed it on to, some of you may remember Anderson Cooper, when she was kind of at the $200 million when she inherited. He's supposedly, there's some difference in statistics, but around $1 million that he inherited, $1.5 million. So it really kind of the big difference is that family didn't do any type of estate planning. They didn't put in place any of the type of things that we're going to talk about today. So they didn't have that those conversations, those family values, those constitutions, so that money, that generational wealth is gone.
Yeah, that is such like an amazing contrast. I mean, to go from basically American royalty down to $1 million in net worth now is pretty nuts. So, we've done a lot of podcasts together, webinars on kind of like the legal stuff for trust. So we can refer back to that. And of course, I think it's always a great idea for people to reach out to you to get one set up. But I have seen more horror stories than success stories, through the grapevine and just talking to other investors over the years about kids inheriting properties. Now, a lot of times it's great. Oh gosh, I have 10 rental properties. I'm going to do it all. And then when I die, my kids get it. But a lot of times, like, they are not passed to the kids appropriately. Like, I use the analogy of like, oh, your kid's never driven a car before. Now, all of a sudden, you die and the kid has to start driving the car while it's going 80 miles an hour down the road. If your kid has no training, that's a recipe for a disaster. And when it comes down to like handing the keys over your rental properties to your kids, the first question is, should I pass on my rental properties to my kids? Do I want my kids as business partners with me in this business? Now, when you talk to your clients, how many of them can say yes to that question, or their kids can take over the properties?
It's very rare. I mean, and some of them, their kids are amazing. It's just their kids have their own profession, their own businesses. They don't want to kind of take over running all these properties, or they don't have the skill set, right? They're not. A lot of my real estate investors who kind of self-manage, the father's the handyman who goes in and does the things, right? And then their kids are engineers or doctors, or it's very common that, especially these days, that their kids live on the other, side of the country. They're on the East Coast and they're not going to really come back and do it. And so, but they also are concerned, hey, I really want this cash flow right now. Like, I don't want to sell it right this moment. Because I don't want to lose out on all that cash flow, but maybe I should, right? I want to do something before I become disabled or incapacitated or get much older and can't do anything.
So like with the kids getting the properties here, because I have a 4-year-old, a 6-year-old, and now a 6-week-old. And so obviously they're way too young right now to ever manage or do anything on the property. But I ask myself, because I've been, grinding at real estate for about 10 years now, and I'm going to grind probably until the day I die in some form or the other. And I ask myself, are my kids willing to do what I have done to build a real estate portfolio? And right now, I don't know. But for people with kids in their 20s and 30s, that's a really good question to ask. Like, if your kids aren't willing to do what you're willing to do, well, then there's a mismatch there on if they can run the properties or not.
Well, and if you have multiple kids, right? So maybe a lot of times there's one kiddo that's really good, but then the other kiddos aren't great. And then there's concern about being conflict or favoritism or infighting. And so we're trying to kind of structure things in a way to put one person in control, but also, not create battles between them later. And then it just becomes even more complicated because I would say the vast majority of my investors are blended families. So they have kids from previous marriages, and this is not their first marriage. And so they're trying to balance all of those dynamics as well.
So 2 things here I think it's really important is first off, if you have kids out there, especially in adult age, got to have frank conversation with the kids. Do they want to run it? Do they have interest in there? And if they do, awesome. If they don't, better to know that now than later so you can properly structure things and do things. The other thing is I think parents need to loop their kids into managing their properties today while everyone's still alive and active and with it, before just hey, switches flip, now you have everything. Again, that set things up for a disaster. So out of the families you see, how often are the kids involved with the properties today?
Very rarely.
Yeah, that's what I see on my side as well with my investors is they talk about it, but their kids don't know what's going on. A lot of them times the kids don't know how many rental properties mom and dad own.
Yeah. And I always say, I mean, this generation, the families that are in the 50s and the 60s, they're getting more transparent, but their parents were the silent generation, and the silent generation didn't talk about anything. So a lot of them still have that kind of some of that feeling of feeling uncomfortable talking to their kids about what they financially actually have. And really, kind of, it's counterintuitive, but the more you talk about them, exactly, all the statistics show when it comes to passing on generational wealth, education as young as possible around how things are run, around your financial values, creating kind of your family core values, all of that has a huge impact on them being ready to take over.
So one of the things I want to rewind, you talked about as a trust recept, like instilling the constitutions and values in there. How can the trust kind of like make sure the kids are aligned with what the parents want?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different options when you set up a trust. I mean, they can be as fluid or as restrictive as you want. So you can be extremely strict and have very specific things in place. Like, I don't want any real estate ever sold. I want this, 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 this. I usually counsel my clients against making it so strict because we just don't know what's going to happen. And you don't want to bind them on things that we can't predict, right? So that's one extreme. You can be extremely restrictive and put every requirement in there. The other extreme is, right, you have no oversight. So a lot of times I tell my clients to create, put someone in charge of it that you trust. And that could be a committee. It could be one person. It could be a professional. It could be an individual. And then give them some guidance. And whether that is a memo or we're putting more restrictions in place. I mean, you can do things like, my kid is required to go to a financial education class before they take over. You can do things like that. But a lot of times, if you really haven't been having the conversation throughout life about that, it might be a little too late at that point for them to go. It's
that class is not going to do much, probably.
That class isn't going to do much. But it's so the earlier you can start with those conversations, the better. But yeah, you can put in place a lot of restrictions, but then you get into the place where you and I have talked about, like, are they, even with all those restrictions, are they going to be equipped to do it? And for them to get the help and the support, is it going to be financially worth it? Like, if they're going to have to pay so many professionals to help them manage it, is it worth them going that route? And
that's the thing too, like kind of going through some options on here. I know a lot of people's plans, and this was my mindset a couple years ago, was, hey, great, I'm just going to pass on my rental properties and the property manager can run it. Well, you still have to manage the property manager. And for everyone out there who's owned rental properties for all, property managers usually have a couple year life cycle, and you still have to know what's going on to manage them effectively. And I have completely changed my mindset. Oh, cool. Just turn over the keys and the property manager can run it. No, I think that's a recipe for disaster. Like, I've talked to a couple property managers and they kind of like, tell me about, oh, this client they inherited 20 rental properties. I hear the details. I'm like, oh, that just sounds like the properties are just under rented. They're poor assets. The clients don't know what's going on. Like, it's not a good recipe. And I don't think like that blind faith in the property manager, you can't do that.
Yeah.
The other thing too is like, think about this. Like, do you want your kids to fully take over the properties? Because one of the things up on my mind, one of my best friends, he lives in Georgia. His grandfather had built an auto parts store in Maryland. They had 14 locations, and they also owned the real estate, owned the stores for the buildings. And then when his grandfather passed away, there were 3 kids inherited. One did great, one was alcoholic, and the other one was indifferent. Well, guess what? For his whole life, the one that ran it all, he was doing all the work, all the back-breaking stuff, and everyone still got a third. And he made a decision that when he was going to pass it, when he was going to pass on to his friend or his son, which is my friend, he was like, I want to make sure everything is done. He sold the business, sold the real estate, because he went through and saw basically the hell he went through. He's like, this is silly. I don't want my kids to go through it. Plus, at that point, 3 people turns into 9 people. Mm-hmm. And that just compounds the problem. I've also seen for a lot of like the deals, especially in some like big apartment building deals where, hey, we're able to go out there and buy an amazing apartment at an amazing price. You know where some of those apartments come from? 5 years after the kids or a spouse has inherited the property and they have no clue what's going on. And an amazing asset turns into like a poorly run asset, poor tenants, high vacancy, the building is trashed. And now they're selling that building at a distressed price. So both of those all sound good on paper, but there's so much like things that can go wrong. So I'm personally the mindset now that like, if I'm gonna fast forward to, 20 years when my daughters are in their 20s and they would be at an age where they could start, actually, I think effectively running the properties. If all three want to run it, awesome. They're going to be trained. They'll be business partners. They're going to be looped in the business from this day. But hey, if one wants to run it and the other two don't, well, then I have a different problem there where I don't want to say, hey, daughter one, you run everything, but then daughters two and daughters three get a third and a third, because that's not fair either.
Yeah.
So at this point, it kind of comes down to like, can my kids handle it? Can my kids run it? And are they all going to do it, or are they not going to do it?
And I think you bring up a good point. And this is, some people at this point in listening might be starting to get overwhelmed because you're having to look so far in the future. And I always say, hey, make your best decisions for right now for the next 3 years.
Yeah.
And then know that you can always revisit this plan every 3 years, hoping that we're, knock on wood, that we're all alive. And so we want to look at long-term strategy. We want to look at, think through that. But like someone like you right now, like you have a good plan for like 20 years, but who knows who you're going to be in 20 years, right? And it's
I hope I'm still alive in 20 years.
Right. So like we've put a good place for right now. Hey, if something were to happen to you guys right now for the next 3 years, what's going to happen? And so for the people who are in their 50s and 60s who are listening to this, who are feeling overwhelmed because they're seeing like 80 and 90, just keep in mind, like, let's put together a plan now for the next 3 to 5 years, and then you can always revisit it, 3 to 5 years from now. And you don't have to create something that hits every backup plan.
No, that's a great point to talk about there, is that you can go on there and update the plan on a regular basis. And kind of, I'm in the mindset now, if I were to unfortunately, die tomorrow, when the properties pass on, I want them all sold within a year. I mean, because number one, my kids are too young to handle it. So right now, hey, if I pass on, sell the properties and liquidate it. And then that cash is much easier to manage through stocks and bonds and other investments where you don't have to know real estate to do that. Yeah. So like that would be kind of my plan now. And kind of looking forward to like other options here. What I've seen some of my clients do is we've kind of traded clients back and forth on brainstorming. Some people have that plan. Hey, I'm going to have the properties and I can pass on to my kids. Some will say, hey, pass on and sell everything. Now, some are selling their rental properties now or starting to sell them off over the next 5-10 years. I'm going to sell kind of like my least favorite properties and start liquidating. I'm going to go out there and start taking some cash off the table. So by the time things happen, I have no rental properties left. And there's a lot of options doing there. Some people are just taking it, paying taxes on there, and they're liquidating. I've seen other people out there. They have the options of going out there and doing more of these like passive investing. And I'm starting to move more of my portfolio that way for a variety of reasons. But one of the interesting things there is because obviously like we always want to like pay the least amount of taxes to Uncle Sam. How do we do that? The nice thing, hey, if all my rental properties were to pass on to my kids, they get the stepped up basis, which means, hey, if I bought these properties for $100,000 and now they're worth $1 million, my kid inherits at the $1 million basis. And if they go to sell it, they're not selling the difference between $100,000. They're selling the profit between $1 million.
Yeah, I would just throw out there, like one of the big mistakes I see with people making is they're not preserving that step up in basis you've just talked about. So I see people add their kids to the title now, and you never want to do that, because if you add your kiddos to the title of the real estate right this moment, then when you die, it's going to be the basis from when you added them to title until the time you die. Whereas if you pass it through a trust, they get the step up of basis. It's the basis is from the time of death to sell.
I did not I think you've told me that in the past, but I totally forgot about that.
We get calls all the time from people who are like, okay, I don't want to deal with probate. I've added my kiddo to title now. And you never want to do that. And you should, if you've done that, you want to talk with a good tax person about how to unwind it and keep the IRS happy. But it's, bad idea.
I think that's a great tip for everyone out there to keep in mind. So again, this is where like it's a very complex subject on here, and why you gotta have like your team in place to like figure out the ideas and revisit as the plans change. So some options going on with the options on here, for some of the people with like, bigger portfolios or bigger equity positions, there's the ability to 1031 into like bigger deals. And this often takes a variety of going into something like a triple net property where it's pretty hands off. You still own it. or you can 1031 into a bigger building and still have that 1031 trips. You're not paying taxes now, but now you're taking some of the active management out off of your plate. Have you seen your clients kind of like shift in direction of doing like kind of selling their properties into more passive stuff through triple nets or some of these bigger deals?
Yeah. And I think for those, for those who don't understand 1031, it's the ability to kind of sell your real estate, put it into another type of real estate and not have to pay the capital gains taxes. But yeah, I see a lot of clients who are looking into that. And I think that's what I was chatting with you about doing that versus REITs, right? And then the types of different, do you get a depreciation on when you're putting into those types of properties, right? Like right now we have such great tax laws, which may or may not change in a few years with the sunset, where you get to depreciate against your W-2. So yeah, I am seeing more and more clients who are liquidating, taking the time right now to find great passive streams, and keeping their passion with real estate, but not leaving their families in a situation where there's going to be a ugly litigation over real estate and a lot of management.
A very common option out there too is called a DST, or Delaware Statutory Trust. And these vehicles, I'm not a huge fan of. They're very attractive because you can sell your property, do a 1031 exchange in there, and be passive, essentially own a REIT of a property or a couple properties. And you get a lot of the great benefits of like, hey, you get the stepped up basis when your kids inherit it. The problem with those that I have looked at is the fees are outrageous. I mean, oftentimes like a 5-6% annual fee. When they turn the property, it's a 10%, like a double digit type fee. And so I have looked at them. I've never been able to pull the trigger. I've had very few clients ever go into DSTs. Do your clients ever talk to you about DSTs?
I get a lot of questions about DSTs, and I feel like I asked you about your thoughts on DSTs, and then we looked at the numbers, and I'm like, that's not a good idea. I think like maybe there's a lot of good marketing right now around DSTs, and then people, you definitely have to check into the fees, and I think you make great points there. So I feel like when people do the comparison, going a different route, like we've talked about, is a little bit like with syndications, is a little bit more, you're going to get more of a return on your investment for sure.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've been, because I mean, this is something I always look at for, like for myself, because I always, I want to build a huge portfolio and I want to be more along the Rockefeller lines versus the Vanderbilt lines, for my kids, in terms of like, not just giving them wealth, but making sure they don't turn into like drug addicts.
Yeah.
Or, that's a very extreme example, but I've so one of my old business partner, non-real estate, random topic here, his wife's relative or something was a nanny for a very, very famous family, not one of these, but say 100-plus-year-old family. And this was the third or fourth generation in Palm Beach, Florida. And she was a nanny with their kids. And she was like, the parents were just, all they did was drink and do drugs every single day. I mean, like from morning to noon, and she raised the kids. It's like, well, cool, you passed on the wealth, but you have turned out, losers to society. Yeah. And I don't want that. So, hey, where do you find that right balance? So one of the trends that's really interesting that I'm seeing for like myself, and obviously like, I like to put together deals, is there's some really interesting options coming like in some of the 1031 stuff where you get a little bit of the best of both worlds. You can 1031 some of these like bigger syndication deals, get the benefits, but also not have the active management as well, and not the downsides of the DSTs. And they're not the triple net properties where you're the sole owner and sole discretion of, hey, I have to figure out what to do with these properties. So with like some of your clients, Pam, what are the common trends you're seeing in them? Like you have these options, we hit them very fast. Do you see your clients kind of going down one road or the other, or is it still like a lot of it, they're figuring things out as they go?
I think they're still figuring it out as they go. And I think one of the things that we've talked about is like in the financial planning world, you work with a financial advisor and they help you rebalance your portfolio, and you do that over time. And like real estate investors, I know kind of your team is really good at helping people kind of rebalance, like the idea of like rebalancing their portfolio and looking at, hey, over time, is this really a good investment. So I think, they're starting to think through these ideas. I mean, we've gone through, like here in Colorado, such major changes in our real estate market and how everything is appreciated and inflation. And so I think, we're coming up for air after COVID. And so a lot of my clients, like because of COVID, were very scared into taking action. Right? Like they started thinking about it. And they, death was in our face that whole time. And so people who had been putting off estate planning, we were so busy during that time.
Oh, you saw a boom then?
We saw a huge boom. I guess now people call it the COVID kiss. Well, in your business, like did really well during COVID. We had the COVID kiss. But I think, people, we're still having the after effects of that, of people really thinking about, especially real estate investors, a lot of reasons they get into real estate is to create that generational wealth. And so a lot of them aren't working with financial advisors. And so they're starting to have these conversations and think about it. But, a lot of what we're doing is kind of in the short term, okay, these are the options. Let's put a legal plan in place. Let's start getting the tools. But we've got to evolve as your strategy evolves,
Yeah, and this is kind of like, all this was kind of like one of the issues or opportunities that led to us kind of like getting property law and the software do a lot more of not the management, but kind of like the financial management and notes in there for the software. Like one of my, longer term goals that in the visions is to help that be like a really good tool. Because I look at myself, as in my family, my clients' families. Hey, when it goes on there, have that be a resource in there where, hey, the properties are in there. You have the numbers. You have all your team members plugged in there. Plus, you have basically like what your business plans for each property. Hey, how's this property run? What's the plan for it? You're going to do this. And that way there's notes in there. So hopefully your family or your kids or your future business partners, they already kind of know what's going on in there. But when you kick the can, they go on there and kind of see some notes on there and say, oh, this property, here's the numbers. Here's a property manager. Here's what's going on. Here's kind of the current thought process where mom and dad left off with the asset. Here's what they're thinking. Like that's one of my big personal visions for myself and the software. So I'm excited for that to progress more. And go ahead.
I was just going to say, yeah, what I really love about Property Llama and that tool is what you're describing. So it's a really great tool for you to make your own kind of financial decisions about your portfolio. But what we've been talking about is how important it is to educate your kids and even not just your kids, your spouse. Like so many times I'm working with couples and one spouse is the primary driving force behind the real estate. And like when they pass away, the spouse has no idea what's going on. And so it's such a great tool to get your spouse on board, to get to educate them, to get the rest of your family members involved in the process.
So, every time we talk about this topic, or I think I always get some like really amazing like emails and phone calls from clients who, hey, they're older, they're more successful, they've got different inputs. I love hearing it. So if you guys have thoughts or plans, reach out to me, reach out to Pam, because this is how we learn. I want to start having like more conversations and get into like more detailed strategies for like what families and what parents can do in these situations. Because like I said, every year I get these, unfortunate stories. Like just last month, I had a client's wife email me, hey, so-and-so unexpectedly passed away in February. I need help with this, and this, what's going on? And like, she was that thing. Like he was the primary driver and she really has no clue what's going on. And like, that's just, it's a tough situation. It's a sad situation. And that stuff is going to happen. How do you make that transition as smooth as possible?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, one kind of like thing, we were talking about like kids here, like how to start teaching your kids. Random thing, I've got with my 6-year-old over spring break, actually over winter break, we started playing Dogopoly. So, Monopoly, but this is a easier version. But Dogopoly.
I love that.
She has loved it. It's been so much fun. And so I'm always curious right now is like, I've been trying to like really understand like, hey, how can I start teaching my kids about money? How can I start teaching them about how to go out there? No more just understand themselves, because we all know the horror stories of like kids, they have no clue when they grow up. So like if parents out there have any like tips they share or books or programs or games, man, let me know. I am trying my best as a dad to go out there and teach my girls. I think your kids are probably too young to start teaching that, Pam, right?
I don't know. So my daughter, we have she loves her little cash register, and we do little scenarios, and she's buying things and I'm buying things from her.
Wow.
Then my book, Legally Ever After, I have a little section of resources for teaching your kids about money of different ages, like age appropriate activities. So you can always get a free copy. We can give a link to the free copy, or you can go to lawmotherco.com to grab it. But
cool. Well, Pam, it's always fun to have in the studio. I appreciate it. I'm excited about a lot more of the content, the conversations we can have around this topic, because it is, like I said, it is a meaty topic. There's so many factors, so many variables on there. But one of my goals is getting to a better rhythm with you and other professionals around the industry to talk about some different angles and, of course, hear from our community. So if you guys have any ideas, great resources, reach out. And, of course, if you guys need a great estate planner, go talk to Pam, go talk to Law Mother. She's done my estate planning and dozens and dozens of clients, and actually probably 100 plus for our podcast listeners as well.
Yeah.
So Pam, I appreciate you.
I appreciate you too, Chris.
Everyone, thank you, and we'll see you next week.